So, presentations of art in 3D. Well, from the very earliest dawn of human history, going back as far as we can remember, the first people always try to make a representation of what they saw in real life, what they saw around them. This is the first record of human presence. And this is a cave drawing from Lascaux. This is 20,000 years old. And it's one of the earliest representations of the world that people of the time were creating. The problem is,
when you flip the page, I'll hit the button.
The problem is that the 3D world that we see has to be represented on a flat surface, on a 2D surface. So one of the great problems of painters and artists was how you represent 3D on a flat surface. About 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, this is a picture on the walls of a pyramid in ancient Egypt. The only way they could really show 3D, or at least some sense of depth, is by painting something on top of something else. So here, the hand of the man is above the hand of the woman. The shoulders and arms of the woman are in front of her chest. This was about the only way they had of showing some kind of a depth perception at all. But the figures are all in profile. The feet are all in profile because they had no sense of showing how to show distortions when you look at the real 3D world. Here also, this is an ancient Assyrian picture. And again, you see the same thing, faces in profile, but one person in front of another, one horse in front of another. This object here, we don't know whether it's meant to be under the horse or behind or in front, because there's no sense of perspective. Wheels are drawn round because that's the only way they could represent a wheel. So this entire, 7,000 years ago, we still have the only way of showing depth is one object in front of another, but things are still very much in profile, wheels are still round. By around 450 BC, the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago, they began to understand distortions due to depth, so that the figures are no longer in profile. There's a slight obliqueness to them. Circles are no longer circles. They realize when you look at a circle at a twist, you get an oval. So circles begin to be seen as ovals, and you begin to see faces that are oblique and slightly turned. So that by this time, 2,500 years ago, the beginnings of depth perception and the way it's shown in art is beginning to be seen here. Also, this is 425 BC. It's the drawing of a Greek temple, and here you begin to see foreshortening. There against, that is in front, that is in back. You begin to see oblique lines to show depth, so that you can see that the temple is receding into the distance, into the background, because these lines are drawn as oblique. They're still drawn as parallel. This is known as parallel perspective. So this is not the way that the human eye really sees 3D, but this is a sensation of depth. So by the time you get to 420 BC, they're beginning to see how to represent depth. In fact, there were better examples. Plato mentions the dramatic use of perspective in the scenery drawings of the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles. So these drawings were apparently quite dramatic at the time, but none of these things have survived. This is a picture, this was a wall mural in Pompeii. So this is now 2,100 years ago or so. And here you start seeing horizon lines, you start seeing vanishing points. So modern, at least ideas that were well ahead of its day are already being seen here as perspective. I'd like to take a little time away from the art to just mention what I mean by perspective and vanishing points. So in the real world, objects become smaller as they recede, so that if you're looking at an object, the front of the object is larger than the back of the object. This is known as foreshortening. The object is foreshortened as you go away. However, the point is how much to foreshorten by. And in order to do this, you create a horizon line at eye level. This is a very distant line as far back as you can go. And the distortions are all work towards that particular vanishing point here. So that basically, if you draw the figures like this towards a vanishing point, you get the correct perspective. This is a single vanishing point. This is what's called one-point perspective, because all of the lines go towards a single point. Most of the time, this is used to show an object where you're looking at it head-on. So when you look at something head-on, the thing vanishes towards a single vanishing point there. There is also a two-point perspective. In two-point perspective, the objects are slightly twisted, which means that there are now two vanishing points, a left one and a right one. So that if you might think of it as that the top and bottom of the box vanish towards the left vanishing point, and the two other sides go towards the right vanishing point. Again, the vanishing points are all on the horizon. There is three-point perspective where the object is not only twisted but tilted, so that you now have three vanishing points. This time, notice the vanishing points are not all on the horizon. And in fact, the fact that these two vanishing points are on the horizon is not common. If you were twisting it so that the vanishing point here went up and the vanishing point here went down and this went across there, you'd get a tilt and a twist as well. But three-point perspective is not often used except when you're drawing very tall buildings. Generally, you only see two-point perspective and one-point perspective. Carry on with the art. During the 14th century, foreshortening and vanishing points began to be appreciated much more and to be used by artists such as Giotto. This is Giotto before the Caliph, painted in 1305. And it does show a sort of vanishing point. It's not a point, there are a series of points. So Giotto understood that the rafters have to vanish towards, get closer and closer together as they recede. But he had not yet, artists at the time had not yet determined that, a vanishing point. So he just drew them willy-nilly, haphazardly. And so you have a whole series of them. The dais here also, this should have been shown in two-point perspective with two vanishing points. Giotto drew them almost in parallel perspective. So by 1305, you're beginning to see the beginnings of perspective, but it's still not completely known how to do this. Notice the figures are not drawn in perspective. They are drawn oblique, but they're not drawn towards any kind of a vanishing point. The first approach to drawing lines and perspectives was made by Brunelleschi somewhere around the middle of the 15th century. Brunelleschi was the architect who designed the cathedral in Florence, in Italy. Around about 1420, he painted this building here. This building is the baptistry of San Giovanni, and the view of this baptistry is from the door of the cathedral in Florence. So if you were standing at the door in the cathedral in Florence, you would see this building opposite it. What Brunelleschi did was that he painted this building, and then he reversed the picture so that the picture is now in front. He put a tiny little peephole about there somewhere, and he placed this entire picture in the doors of the cathedral. Halfway between the doors of the cathedral and the actual building, he put a mirror. Around the edges of the picture, he put burnished metal, so that the metal would reflect the sky, which would be reflected in the mirror. He then had people standing behind the picture, looking through the peephole, and people were fooled into thinking they were really seeing the baptistry. Apparently, it was such a dramatic thing that people did not know they were looking at a mirror. The picture itself, this picture that he drew, has disappeared. It no longer survives. This particular description was made by one of the biographers of Brunelleschi, where he mentions this detail. A few years after Brunelleschi, people began to see much more about perspective and vanishing points. You have now, this is around about the 15th century. This is the Holy Trinity by Masaccio. And you can see that the figures are all working towards the vanishing point. Everything here, the perspective, it's all correct. This is the oldest